we could do maybe a check-in with folks just to see where you're at and how you're feeling about this. And what I was going to do today is I was going to propose, because I haven't really posted a structure for this. I kind of wanted to talk about it and see if we can work out between ourselves what makes sense as a structure. I'm really pleased because the Milton, the Blake was kind of my original idea to cross connect with Savitri, but the Whitman is an interesting current that I'm not quite sure how exactly it fits in, but since I love Whitman, I'm happy to include him in the mix. And Andrew being here as a kind of spokesman, maybe, for Whitman, I think is a strength to the exercise.
Sorry about that. Someone is changing my one of my keys doesn't work for my new apartment, so someone is changing the lock on the door.
Okay.
So I have to move into the weird dim room.
Into the dark, the darkness visible room.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm mad at myself because a few days ago I saw the complete work, all of complete works of Milton, for $2 in this, budget bin in front of a used bookstore. And I said, oh, I'd love to get this, but I already have a complete works of Milton. And I've been looking all over for it and I can't find it. So I should have just bought it for $2. Who cares if you have 2 complete works of Milton? But anyway, I did find an anthology with the first 2 books of Paradise Lost. I found, and I did find the complete William Blake. And I have a edition of this, Leaves of Grass. I don't know which edition this is, but it's introduced by Bloom. I think it's, I don't know. How many editions of Leaves of Grass are there? Maybe I'll learn about that. So I'm looking forward to this event. Thanks.
I think there were.
So I also.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Andrew. I was just going to say. I also wanted people to sort of say a little bit about their background in relation to Blake, Milton, and Whitman. Just how often have you encountered them? What is importance do they have in your life? I don't know, anything about it.
Well, I'll just complete that thought. And I do know Whitman. Leaves of Grass has been with me for, I don't know, since high school. Remember that one about, there's a woman in a window, she's looking out on the men who are like swimming in the lake, and she has this erotic fantasy about these men running around out in the lake. And I thought, oh, I didn't know anything about Whitman except this was in high school. And I just thought, oh, I don't know what this is about this guy, but this really turns me on. And it wasn't until later that I realized that he was the great master of the body electric. And he, I think he really comes from he just carved out a very special place for himself in American poetry. In a way, he created American poetry. I think Whitman and Dickinson were the, shaped American literature very dramatically. But I think he's been very close to my heart. And I absolutely adore this particular. And also some of his, I think it's drum beats, a lot of his war poems are just thrilling. And Blake, I know a little bit better than I haven't read all of Blake, but I've read bits and pieces of it. And the one that I think the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, interests me the most. It's very weird. And his paintings, of course, his drawings, I find thrilling. I saw a show of his about, 20 years ago at the Met, where there were about 200 of his pictures, and I almost fainted. I'm not kidding. I just went into a total spin. And I went back many times, and I brought friends of mine, because to me it was like a profoundly altered state of consciousness. So I think those are and Milton. Milton is a little stiff for me. And I think he's also in the shadow of Shakespeare, who is such a giant. But I do acknowledge the language is very beautiful, but it doesn't move me a great deal. But what does move me is the character of Mephistopheles, which is just a gigantic achievement. And those descriptions of hell are just thrilling. But what also fascinates me is the Civil War, from which Milton had some transformational political experience. And I think that's probably what he has in common with the author of Savitri, because both of them were very politically engaged and were playing the role of the rebel. And they later wrote these kind of epic poems. So that's my first sort of spin around these three poets and what I think might be connecting them. Thanks.
Andrew, did you want to go? You wanted to speak when Tony came in.
Oh yeah, I know John mentioned about the editions of Leaves of Grass, and I think there were at least 10 editions, and it was his like life's work. So he was constantly revising, from the time at which it was published, throughout his whole life. And actually, if you read the last edition of Leaves of Grass, which was maybe like, I don't know, I'm guessing 1893 or 1897, it's in a lot of ways really different from the first edition, the 1855 edition. And I personally like the 1855 edition the best. And that's what you have, John. That's the 1855 edition. And there's a lot of interesting things to think about in terms of like why the 1855 edition, which is like the first, might be arguably more interesting than the last. And like, I don't know if you guys have ever read Wordsworth, but something similar kind of could be argued happened with him, which is that when he wrote the first edition of the Prelude, which is, I don't know if you guys ever read the Prelude, but it's absolutely wonderful and astonishing, whatever. He was like a radically he had a sort of radical subjectivity that allowed him to like experience and write that first edition of the Prelude. But by the time he was an older man and he was revising the Prelude, he'd kind of like, I don't know what you want to say, he kind of ossified or something. And and anyways, the last edition of Prelude is not as good as the first edition. So it's something to think about. But and also, John, you mentioned the part with the bathers and the woman looking through the window. That's a really, 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 really famous part of Song Myself. And sometimes it's called the bathers episode. And I agree with you, it's utterly erotic and powerful and really moving. And I've always thought, have you guys ever come across that part? Jeffrey or Marco or Doug, have you guys ever read that?
I'm sure that I have, but it's a long time ago and it's somewhere in the fog of memory right now.
Okay.
And I read all of Song of Myself, but I don't remember that particular section,
I'll find it. It's very sexy, though.
Yeah.
Very.
Well, one of the reasons why I've always loved the bathers episode is because like I think you can plausibly read that episode. What happens is there's a woman who is looking through a window maybe, and she sees like 28 bathers in the water, and she describes how beautiful these men are, and like the water dripping from their hair, and like, but the best part about that episode for me is that you can read it as Whitman the woman as like a stand-in for Whitman, and Whitman is like expressing how strong his longing is, like for contact with these men. But at the same time, he or the woman, they don't like reach out towards them. They just like watch them. So it's like really interesting and weird. Like, and I think that we could talk about this later, but that might have something to do with like Whitman is always witnessing things. And I mean, he's also, I guess you could say he's participating in things, but like, I don't know what that would even mean in terms of the poems he writes. I mean, like, yeah, but he's sort of he's like this witness in some ways. That might be one way you could think about him. But and then yeah. So anyway, so briefly, so I've been reading Whitman for a while. I wrote about him when I was a graduate student, and wrote some literature review about criticism of Whitman like years ago, and came probably to Whitman through Bloom, like a lot of poets I like. And yeah, so then with Blake, I know less about. I've tried reading some of his epics in the past and find them quite difficult. I don't know if they're really possible to like, I'm sure I've tried to read them just like straight up, you know, whatever, but I don't know. I think secondary material could probably be helpful in terms of coming to terms with Blake's like universe or his cosmology or whatever word you want to use. And yeah, and then Milton, I know even less about. I mean, I wrote a paper about him when I was undergrad. It was about Satan, who obviously, as John said, is clearly the best part of the Paradise Lost is Satan. And Blake was actually, Blake famously said that Milton was of Satan's party, and he was a true poet for that reason. Meaning like Satan is Milton's greatest creation, in that a lot of people argue, including Bloom, that like God in Paradise Lost is like a total groaner. Like he's just this like yawn-inducing, like annoyingly innocuous and benign presence, and that like is totally outshadowed by like the powerful enigma of Satan, you know, which is like amazing if you think about it. But yeah, so that's my knowledge about Milton. I don't know anything about his politics. I'd love to learn more.
I'm going to correct myself. I think I said my first, I think I said Mephistopheles. I didn't mean Mephistopheles. I meant Satan.
Yeah, Satan.
I correct myself. Mephistopheles, I think that's Faust or Marlowe. Marlowe did Mephistopheles.
Well, Faust too. Yeah.
But there's a sort of prototypes, I think, for the creative variation. I think that Milton does with that character. He I think puts his own unique imprint upon him. And I'm drawing on, and was his name Fletcher? I think you mentioned him, Andrew, a critic that I think, and I have a couple of his books which I've not read. One of them is The Colors of the Mind, which I think you quoted once. And I think there's a whole chapter on Milton that I want to get to. But I love one thing he says about Milton is he doesn't, what's so scary about Paradise Lost is in those scenes in hell, it's so vague. You don't know exactly where you are. And that's what's scary about it, is that Milton actually creates this space that's so, it's creepy and weird because you don't have any clear reference points for where you are. So I'm remembering that. Thanks.
And then one more thing I just want to add is that I think Bloom has actually argued that Paradise Lost can be read within the context of science fiction. So that's something to think about, because it is actually really weird and strange book. And science fiction might give us a sort of texture or context to see how strange it really is. Yeah. Cool.
I'll respond to your question, Jeffrey, about familiarity with these different authors. And I have to confess that just entering into this, doing this reading and I feel like it's bringing up all senses of inadequacy in me with respect to being, I feel like this is, Paradise Lost or any, they've been read so much, and there's been so much scholarship on these books, and there's people who have not only read them multiple times, but memorized the texts. And so they've all been kind of interpreted to death in a certain way. But as I'm approaching them, I haven't read Paradise Lost before. I've read Whitman, various parts of it. I've read various parts of Blake. But I've also realized the gulf, or I kind of feel a certain gulf in knowledge, and that's actually exciting insofar as it's all new, and so it's like discovering like a treasure trove, like for the first time, and so I don't want to pretend like I know more than I do, because I don't really know that much. And for me, like I like the metaphor that I'm working with, or that works for me as a reader, is that of a bee, like a honeybee. And so I feel that in my life, when I reflect back to like what has enchanted me as a reader and drawn me in and made me care enough about it to do the work to learn, to become learned about the work, it hasn't followed a kind of comprehensive path. And in a way, this event and these reading groups that we've been doing are kind of like a surrogate for graduate school, for which various times I've been tempted to sign up for. I've wanted, since I left school, I wanted to go back to school and continue, continue feeding the flames that had been ignited, when I first encountered, the great works, and when they were first really shown to me, because it took teachers, and it was only 2 or 3, professors or grad students who, just had like that, were able to convey the enchantment of the text, were able to meet, the kind of longing passion that I had for the poetic experience, and become sort of mediators, in that regard, and so like I'm coming to this just with the desire to be immersed in beautiful language, and in a way, for me, it's almost like it feels like at this phase in my life. And it happens also to be summertime. It's peak summertime. It's, the end of July. So everything is fully in bloom. Nature is flourishing. And there's sort of a reawakening of just the pure poetic music, the desire to enjoy the text, like for the pleasure of the text. But more than the pleasure, because it really brings with it a whole complex of thoughts, a whole complex of ideas. And there's, one of the things that's interesting about this text, just from the outset encountering it, is that it's a combination of 2 things. It's the lyricality of the language, and it's also a set of arguments. It strikes me as a theological and a cosmological argument. Something about human being in the cosmos, and what the meaning of that is, and that is remains a pressing question, I think, in ways that are obscured by everything else that's going on, in our lives and in the media sphere. And so I want to come to these texts, I guess, like as sources of like inspiration for working with what we are facing in our realities now. So I think this might get to some of the, although Andrew stepped away, some of the conversation that we've been having about aesthetics and ethics and art and life. And to me, like what the meaning of poetry is, if it's something more potentially than purely a form of entertainment or of sensual experience, if it also has intersections, like say with the political and certainly with like the existential. Milton himself is a very interesting figure. He was aging, he was blind when he wrote this poem. He didn't write the poem, actually. He recited it, and his daughter, as I've learned from some of the preparatory reading, was received the words and wrote them down. And then there's the whole thing that like I have the it's the what is this, the Modern Library, and there's some really great critical text introducing biographical historiographical text introducing the poem, and really good notes. So it's also like connecting certain dots. We connect this to Savitri and the relationship that Milton had with power. I think King Charles was the one. Cromwell, he was I guess an ally of Cromwell, and essentially, he was arrested for some time, right? He was in jail, as was Aurobindo. And so, I think that we have to look at that dimension of things as well, and, not just approach this from the perspective of kind of an academic, industry or an academic continuity, because we're kind of outside of that space here. And in a way, I think there's perhaps a parable or an allegory that we might draw for contemporary times. And I like what Andrew said about the connection with science fiction, because there is certainly, as you said that, I thought of Stranger Things and the upside down world of luminous darkness and of ambiguous shapes and that kind of liminal zone. It's very resonant, actually, I think, with the contemporary. So to me, this is I'm just a bee buzzing, and I'm been attracted by the nectar that is in obvious profusion in this work, and to have some comrades with whom to explore and enjoy the text is very attractive, and it's worth getting up early for and being here.
Well, Marco, there's always someone that's a little bit worse or in a worse situation than yourself. So I'm that person. I have next to zero experience with any of these poets. Haven't read any of the texts, and just sitting here now, I've reflected on my poetic life and how it's flourished since arriving in the presence of what we do here. And I was introduced to poetry when I thought I was ready to graduate from undergraduate school, and I had one course that I was required to do. And so I decided to save up some money and go abroad. I went to Swansea, Wales, and I just had to take this one course. So I had so much free time to explore different aspects of, well, the landscape, the country. And that time I took two courses. I took the required biology course and a course on Wallace Stevens. And of course, he opens up quite a bit into reality and imagination. And I explored all other poets there. Dylan Thomas is from Wales, and so I experienced his writing. But all these bigger names, even there might be internal gasps when you hear that I've not read Shakespeare. I've not read, besides what Johnny did the other week with Romeo and Juliet, and a few memorizations during high school or something. So these are all foreign objects to me that that have been attracted to me somehow, that have been pulling me in. And as I bloom into the writings of Harold Bloom and others, and there's so much going on in this world that needs to be experienced. And I guess to keep it short, this is the place to do it. As Marco mentioned, going to graduate school, at least financially and logistically for me at this time, is a poor choice. And this is the place to be. This is the place to do it. I trust everyone's judgment here. The selections that have been made by of the three giant poets, by three respected individuals here. So I'm similar to the Bateson group. I'm coming into this without much knowledge of what we're discussing, but I know I'll come out of it with so much. So looking forward to what arises here.
Though I have to say, I follow Doug on Goodreads, and I know, Johnny, you're a very big reader, but on Goodreads, his annual challenge for this year for Doug is 104 books, and he's read over 60 of them so far, according to his thing. So he's always, we always like Doug because he's a little bit modest about his contributions, but they're actually a lot stronger than he suggests. and there's the same example again.
I think if Marco's the bee, I'm imagining myself as the firefly. So there's a lot of dormancy, but come nighttime, there's something flashing somewhere in there.
So my, I mean, of the three poets, I know them all. I mean, Blake I know less well. In a way, I know Milton second best, and Whitman I actually know quite well, because I've carried around Leaves of Grass since I was about 14 years old. And I used to know several of the poems by heart. I could recite, I can't anymore, but I could recite, I saw an oak in Louisiana growing, that one. And I could recite The Dalliance of the Eagles, because that was the poem that excited me erotically when I read Whitman. So I used to recite that all the time, and pieces of I Sing the Body Electric and Song of Myself. So those ones have inhabited me for a very long time. I remember I was stunned by the what's the word, abundance of Whitman's writing. I mean, you know, you open Leaves of Grass and you don't get the small poems. You get Song of Myself right up front is the one that you go into, and you're just immersed in its abundance when you go into that. And I remember it was complete a revelation for me in terms of poetry, that you could be so abundant inside poetry in this way. And it made me rethink poetry in a way, encountering Whitman. And so, I mean, that's why I say I love this idea of bringing Whitman into the mix of what we're talking about. Milton I read, so I took a undergraduate literature course at the university, and we essentially read through the Norton Anthology. Some of you may know that it's actually a 2-volume thing, and I think we read all of volume 1 and 3/4 of volume 2 over the course of the session, or maybe it was 2 classes. I can't remember. It might have been 2 classes, so Paradise Lost was in that mix. We had a prof who was an Old English scholar. So he read sections of Chaucer to us in the Old English, which was extraordinary. So I've remained a lover of Chaucer my whole life as a result of that. But we also read Milton, Paradise Lost out loud in class some of the sections. So again, that's also a very strong memory. And so I've felt this pull to go back to read Paradise Lost for a long time. And now we're starting to read Savitri. And when we read a bit of Savitri in the Aurobindo reading last year, in the Life Divine reading, it was so clear to me when we read, I remember we had a discussion with Matthew about the influence of Milton on Aurobindo's writing, and the fact that he had read Milton and there were clear parallels there. And so with this idea of delving into Savitri, I felt almost compelled to pick up Milton and reread it in order to make these linkages between the two. Of course, Savitri is a text about the goodness. It's kind of the darkness is there, but it's secondary in somehow. And obviously Milton is, even though it's a poem about goodness, all the focus is on the darkness in order to point back to the goodness. So it's a very different perspective than Savitri. So it's almost a contrasting thing rather than simply a comparison, I think, or simply a looking at the interrelations as a mirroring. It's less a mirroring, I think, than it is a kind of contrasting. So anyway, I think that's an interesting thing. And for Blake, so I have read bits of Blake for years, obviously some of the images that have spoken to me. But I have a good friend in Quebec City that I met last year, who's a specialist of her. She's a doctorate in history of art, and she did her doctorate on Maurice Chabas, who's a mystic painter from the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the 1800s and in the beginning of the 1900s. If you look him up, you can sort of see, and she has a whole collection of his paintings in her house, originals, which are, I think it's probably the largest collection of Maurice Chabas paintings outside of museums in the world, probably, or something like that. And Chabas was partly inspired by Blake. And so the discussions I've had with her about Chabas have been strongly overshadowed by Blake's writings, and not just his writings, but also his illustrations. And so we've started to collaborate on this together, and we're now actually preparing a presentation on Blake and Chabas and the relationships between them. And so this is kind of a passion right now with me. So since I started looking at this, I started looking at the illustrations. I've started to try some Blake-inspired illustrations in my drawing side of my work, and I have been reading Blake before we got into this. So I don't have a huge background in Blake, but I have been working my way through the Songs of Innocence and Experience. I've worked my way through The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Oh, I did want to say something about The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. My wife wrote a book called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell in her poetry. And so that is also an echo for me that goes back into the past. Anyway, so I have a lot of personal stake in these poems, in these poets. And so I'm here not as an academic, even though I am. It's not my area in academics anyway. But I'm here more because these poets, like the Savitri reading, speak to me. And they do so, they speak to me literally because they are oral texts. They are texts that are meant to be read. Even Blake, which is not exactly the easiest poet in the world to read, it makes sense to read it orally out loud. Whitman, of course, it's almost required to read that out loud. And of course, the same is true of Milton. So I'm hoping that we can do that here, just as we're doing Savitri reading out loud, that we can do some of the reading here out loud in order to work through this kind of material. I think that's what I have to say about that. In terms of procedures, we've lost Fran Andrew again. I think he's got his locksmith issues. I hope it's coming back.
Well, I could respond just for a moment while he before we get to procedures, because that would probably be of interest to him. So the bit about personal stake, and just as I'm about to talk, a train is going to pass through, but I am definitely here with a personal stake. I want to say, and I've been thinking about music and not just the musicality of the language, which is given, but kind of the mode of transmission, and the way that, you know, when you fall in love with certain music, you listen to it over and over again, and you discover layers of it, you know, through repeated listenings, and it kind of gets into your playlist, and it becomes part of your atmosphere. It becomes part of like the soundtrack to your life. Or that's one way of, you know, looking at it, kind of a shallow way of looking at it in a way, because all right, train, boxcars. But I think that we, or at least in my, if when I have followed my heart, I'll say, it's really from love to love. It's like from enchantment to enchantment, and so with the poetry is much like the music, and there's a kind of interweaving, there's a braiding there. My initiatory experiences were with friends, listening to music and having Dionysian kind of experiences. We didn't have that language quite yet, but that's what it was. It was listening to music and appreciate, like not just appreciating it critically and sort of from a distance, but like as kind of participants, you know, in a ritual of like this kind of insight, because it's also a kind of form of cognition, you know, which is an interesting part of it. And as we get deeper into the music, then you want to know who informed, or who were the people that you loved, who did they love? And so that's how we kind of, I think, step back. So for me in high school, it started with rock music, Led Zeppelin and Aerosmith and these terrible bands, but they had this also like esoteric and mystical quality, and you know, we wanted to know who were they listening to, and that's how you get to the blues, and you get to into Celtic mythology and all kinds of, you know, streams that flow into like the contemporary. And I think that like as kind of like love follows love, we end up back to like the kind of sources, like these grand sources like in our history that are actually still alive and present, because they've come to us through our loves. And so that's how I got to Whitman, for example. It was through Ginsberg, and the same with Blake, because I fell in love with the Beats and Kerouac and Ginsberg and all them, and through music, and the music through jazz, and the jazz through like Jimi Hendrix. And so it all kind of interconnects. And then that's how I started reading Blake, and then I picked up Songs of Innocence and Experience and Tiger, Tiny Tiger, Burning Bright, and Forests of the Night, What and More, you know, all. And my interest is as a poet. I want to enrich my own poetry by drawing on all this richness, like that for the most part through our kind of educational channels and through the media, you know, the matrices, is strangled we don't actually access it. Like we lose access to it. We just get the surface level kind of mimesis, the imitations. And if you penetrate through the surface and you penetrate into like, you know, down to the roots, and this is just one stratum of it, because, you know, we go deeper and deeper to the Bible and biblical literatures, and then, you know, and then we get into kind of archaic spaces. But that's my interest, is enriching like our own culture, because it's been so emaciated, I think, by by just the transformations that have come in some ways through the very types of dynamics that are being described in a certain kind of language in these texts. And they also give us ways out. They give us ways, I think, to the future. So Whitman's just broad, encompassing like embrace of everything that he saw gives us, I think, a way to relate, even with like the onslaught of contemporary experience, which arguably is, well, I don't know. That's part of my inquiry, really, is, what would be a Whitmanian voice, right, for the digital wasteland, right? That's, to me, a poetically interesting question. And so that was just to riff and respond to your provocation, Jeffrey, and also to fill up time while we were waiting for Andrew to get his lock fixed.
Yeah, I'm really sorry about that. It actually wasn't the, now my screen is brighter. It wasn't the lock, it was actually my internet connection, which I didn't think was a problem, but apparently is sort of wonky, at least right now. So, but it seems to be working okay now. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, why don't we, if you guys want to read some poems and we can talk about them? I have here my trusty Library of America Whitman. This is a good, Library of America comes out with great editions of thinkers and poets. They're always a little bit more expensive, but they are a good investment, I think. And so this is the Whitman Library of America. And it's collected poetry and collected prose. It has the 1855 edition, and then the 1891 edition, and then a lot of his prose works. Yeah, so we could start with, you want to start with Song of Myself, the 1855? You guys want to do that?
The whole thing today, right now?
No, we can just read a passage and talk about it.
Could we? Yes, I would like to do that, but could we pause just a minute? Because I just wanted to follow up on what Marco just said. And sure. I'm still in that, what's our approach kind of mode, because this is a long haul, okay? So I think we need to really put a lot of things on the table so that we're doing Milton, Whitman, and what was the other guy? Blake, okay? These are, I think, epic, right? Long poems. And I think they're plugged into Homer and Virgil, and most importantly, the Bible. So these are the currents, I think, that are moving through these poets. But I think there's a big difference in Homer and Virgil and these poets, because this is written speech. I think the Homer, of course, those were based upon formulas, and they were very performance oriented. And that's a very different kind of thing, I think, from what Milton is doing or what Shakespeare was doing. But certainly there's a relationship, because they were working with very large texts. They built these incredible, very long poems. And what were they doing? I think this is very challenging to figure out. But I remember reading some researchers, they went to Finland, and they found up in the mountains somewhere, a community that still had an oral tradition, where they had huge chunks of some Finnish mythological poem memorized. And we're talking about hours and hours and hours. And they said how they did it was, And it was never, and these people were studying it with tape recorders, you know, so they recorded it, these performances, and then they studied it. And they tried to look for the patterns, and they were mostly interested is how in the hell could these people memorize this much material? And what I thought was interesting is that two guys who had these poems memorized, they sat next to each other and they held hands like this, like two skaters, ice skaters, and they rocked back and forth. And they just started. It poured out of one of them, and then the other one would take over. So it seems to me that there must have been something so incredibly embodied and rhythmic and hypnotic. And I think that written speech, and it is glorious, but I mean, Shakespeare and Euripides, Euripides, I think, was definitely a dramatist, so he was writing speech, and actors memorized those speeches and delivered them. And there was a kind of depth and a precision and a complexity that happens with written speech that is absent from Homer with the Iliad and the Odyssey. They're bigger than life, but they're types. And that's very different from Euripides' Medea, who's this very quirky, weird, uncanny, incredibly powerful woman who's extremely verbal. And she's psychologically exquisitely aware of herself and aware of others around her. This is something that Homer could never do. And I think maybe oral cultures cannot really accomplish that kind of complexity. So I'm just putting that out there because I agree that I think we're working with the neck up most of the time. And I think it's exacerbated by our media. I think we're losing touch with the voice and the power that we're capable of tapping into. We don't use it very often because we don't need to, because this medium is very small. It's not like a big amphitheater where we have to reach, like the great orators did, to the back of the house. And you think of like those great debates between Lincoln and Douglas, which was not that long ago, about 200, maybe 150 years ago, 200 years ago. These were like 4-hour events at midday in the summer. And 20,000 people would show up for these events. And each, they were all running for president, these Douglas and Lincoln, they each spoke for an hour. Then the other one spoke for an hour. Then the other one spoke for an hour. 4 hours. And of course, they were exhausted at the end of it. Everyone was probably exhausted. But I'm just saying, what kind of attention spans did these people have that we obviously do not have now? So I'm hoping we can, as many of us are students of Gebser, and he's talking about the aperspectival, the integral age, what would that be like? I say it wouldn't be anything, we already have it. We already have what we need. We don't have to make ourselves into superhumans. We just have to pay attention to the structures that we've already moved through. And I think the voice is the instrument we need to start tapping into, because this is where the richness of this poetry is. It's in the voices, in the multiple voices. So I'm remembering, I can't remember his name, is Buck is his last name. I can't remember his first name. He wrote a famous book though called Cosmic Consciousness. And he was sitting around with his friends at night, probably a couple of beers or a couple of glasses of wine, and they recited poetry. One of them was Whitman. I think the Romantics, Wordsworth and others, were a part of that poetry reading. And then he went out in his carriage. It was in Toronto, I believe. And I think it was a cold night. And he had a cosmic experience. A blinding flash of light. He was engulfed in this golden light, no beginning, no end, a total cosmic download, very dramatic. And then it vanished. And he was left totally bewildered. But I suspect, I'm pretty sure, that that kind of cosmic, the conditions for that cosmic download were prepared by that poetry reading. And that would be, if we're talking about aspiration, what I would want to have happen is a cosmic download for each of us at the rate that's most appropriate for you as an individual, because I don't want anyone to blow a fuse. So, but I think we have everything that we need. We have voices, you know, we can look at each other face to face. We can use gestures. And I believe that that's what's missed. That's what I missed in my English classes, because I didn't know why I loved the poetry, except when I went to English class. And the English teacher inevitably would do a sonnet of Shakespeare and she would butcher it. And I was wondering, what's missing here? What's the disconnect? Later on, I went to drama school and I learned what was missing. That, you know, a lot of English teachers and English professors are working with the neck up. They're working high levels of cognitive capacity. But that, where the power of the poetry comes from is the gut. It's the chest. It's your butthole. That's where the energy is coming from. What you do with it and your cognitive capacity is very important in learning how to give a size and a shape to all of that. But that's where my frustration has been in my appreciation for poetry. And most of the time, I haven't studied poetry in school much, but it's always a bottle of wine at home, usually by myself. Occasionally, I'll, you know, maybe bore someone shitless because I'll have to recite out loud. But I think there's that, I think we're sort of cut off from those 19th century roots where people did a lot of poetry together. They read out loud or they played the piano together, but it wasn't something that was pre-recorded and they could just sit back and absorb in a passive way. So those are some of my hopes for this group, is that we can reconnect to those somatic intelligences, which we may be dormant in many of us because we just haven't been called upon to use them.
Go ahead, Doug.
I just briefly want to, well, thank you, John. That was very helpful. And I do want to incorporate the body more. I've got these nifty earphones as a gift, because I can't have the volume up wherever I'm at often. But now I have more freedom, so there might be more body work going on with me. So I'm looking forward to that. And along with reading aloud, allowing out loud reading, I would like for us to, doesn't have to be as it has been done in the past, but to have individual takes as we've done before, with introductions from particular individuals who are present within the group. So 1 week Marco, 1 week Jeffrey, 1 week Andrew, 1 week John, 1 week me, or something like that. And whoever else might show up, if they'd like to do an introduction. That way we get different perspectives that way. I always appreciate that. That's all for now.
What I had in mind, but I'm just going to run it by. I don't have a full idea. I just have a few ideas about how to start this. The way we sort of set this up is because I also, even though it's kind of implicit here, I don't want to forget or neglect the Savitri connection either. Even though maybe some of that discussion will come up in the other group rather than this group, but I want to keep that channel open, as it were. So I was going to suggest that we sort of, because we've got time with this, the Savitri reading is going to go on for 2 years. And we're on the intervening weeks between the Savitri readings. So we don't have to rush this, which is maybe a good thing, because as Johnny said, you know, these are all epic things in different ways, because Milton is an epic. Blake isn't exactly an epic. But it's very, very dense reading, and Whitman isn't an epic in the same way either, but it's also very pregnant. I don't know if that's the right word, but anyway, filled. It's not difficult, but it's complex reading, I think, in a way. and very body grounded as well. That's one of the things I always liked about Whitman, is it's so grounded in the body. And I would like to do some reading today, as you suggested, Andrew. I just want to sort of get a little bit of sense of how we will structure the next few meetings, for instance. Maybe we don't have to have a full understanding of where we're going to be 6 months down the line. I'm not sure we'll run this group the full 2 years of the other group, but we'll do this as long as we need to do in relation to the other one. So I had in mind, I haven't read Paradise Lost fully. I read the first 2 books out of the 12. I don't think you can do one book I'm not sure you can read aloud one book each time. It might need to be broken up into several meetings. But I kind of like to start off like the next meeting that we have, the first one after the Savitri reading starts, with the book 1 from Milton, and work our way through that. Then switch from Milton to the Blake and or the Whitman as a kind of cross reading before going on to, and sort of alternate the readings in Milton with the readings in the other 2. But again, it's just an idea, and I wanted to sort of see what you thought about it. I agree, Doug, we'll move the animation across the group so that each person will take on the responsibility for some of the animation as we go. Blake is a bit of a challenge. I think maybe we're all a little bit lost at sea in Blake. More so even than I think, Milton, some of us know roughly what's going on there, but Blake is a hard one to get a handle on. So I thought we could start with the marriage of heaven and hell because it's related to the reading of Milton, and although it's not necessarily an easy piece to start, it's just a relatively short piece. It has that advantage. And Songs of Experience, Innocence and Experience is also an easier piece in Blake to read than it's a series of poems, not a single piece, but there is a common vision through it. So I think those are maybe the 2 texts that are a little bit more accessible. I looked briefly at his poem called Milton, which we will probably end up reading, but it's not, I don't think, it's not that easy a piece to read. So it's gonna have to, as Andrew says, we're gonna have to use other source material to help us through some of these texts, especially in the Blake. Andrew, I think we're going to rely on you to help us with the Whitman in sort of understanding. So maybe we won't have to read so many secondary sources because you will be able to help us flesh out some of those other currents that are present in Whitman. But I'm still a little bit unsure, although I love the resonances, I'm still a little bit unsure where these poets, how they speak to each other, I guess. I understand how I speak to each of them individually, but I don't understand how Milton talks to Whitman or how Whitman talks to Blake. These things I don't, and those are the parts of the conversation where I don't want to structure things too much because I want to see what comes out of the discussion and maybe that orients where we go with these things. So I'm sort of suggesting maybe the next 2 sessions, so the middle of August and then the end of August. Was it the first and the third week or the second and fourth? I can't remember now. Doug, you corrected me on those times and I'm confused about them now.
The second, the fourth, and the fifth. Unless I'm wrong right now.
No, second and
I
fourth.
know the fifth.
Yeah, so the second and the fourth. So we won't meet for another 3 weeks because there's a week. Is there a Wednesday next week? I think.
We could potentially meet next week if we find it useful.
Yes, we could. That's true. Yeah. So I'm going to leave it open for other people to talk and make suggestions, and then we'll come back to the reading, Andrew, because it would be not. I agree. It would be nice to at least tie down a little bit some of the oral below the neck work.
Wait, so just so I understand, so for the Paradise Lost, when we discuss Paradise Lost, are we just going to be reading the poem out loud, or are we going to be discussing it, or what? How is that going to work?
A little bit like what Matteo is doing with Savitri. I suppose I propose that we read maybe half the canto, half the book, aloud to each other, and then discuss it.
Okay. Gotcha.
We read the second half of the book, and then we discuss it. Something like that as a framework.
Okay.
I think Milton, we can break up the books a little bit and stop and discuss that way, because it's not quite the same mindfulness that we have for the Savitri reading, which they don't want to break up that way. But
one of the ways I've been thinking about texts lately, which has been a subtle but I think an important shift for me, is to look at them more like musical notations than like representations of concepts that I have to understand. And so I like the word you used, animate. I think that that's maybe an appropriate way to approach these texts, like in that when we read them, and this could be the case reading alone or could be the case reading together, we're animating these notations and, in a sense, invoking the perceptions that were encoded into the words by the poet. I think that there's what I think potentially an interesting connection to be made in the perceptions. Like, what is Milton looking at? Like, what's he seeing? Like when he sees Satan, when he sees pandemonium, when he sees paradise. What is Blake seeing? I mean, the seeing is important here, as important, I think, as voice, because one thing that unites these poets is the visionary quality, and that's I think it's different in Aurobindo. I think that's going to be just an interesting thing to observe, like really what like you said earlier, he's really illuminating the good. He's not presenting a kind of negative cosmology in a way that this, I think, at least my sense of the interpretations around it around Paradise Lost suggests. So what I think we could do, though, I mean, is in a way like an ensemble, like animate these texts, maybe portions of them. It's like take a piece that we can handle in the given time frame, to give it the attention, to really bring out the nuances, the richness, the depth of the voice, the kind of resonances of the because part of what we could bring, combining our respective, albeit partial intelligences and familiarities, is like, what does that, what do we hear in those lines? What do we hear or see in those images? And I think combining some of that could bring more of that amplification effect, more of an amplifying effect to to the words in a way that, you know, we're kind of resonating with each other, like, you know, like our bodies as we read become resonant chambers. And I think that could be part of like what enables that download as well. I was reading Yeats yesterday. I just kind of picked it up, just opened it up to the anthology, and I was looking for distraction, honestly. And Carmen was there, the girls, and I wanted to read something aloud, and so I you know, the anthologized poem, the most anthologized poem, the Lake Isle of Innisfree. And I recalled the reading that he did, and I recalled, you know, the fact that Yeats did seances customarily with, you know, with his wife. And if you listen to him reading this poem, it doesn't sound like an English teacher reading it at all. It sounds like a psycho having, you know, speaking with the other side. And so that's not what all of these poets are doing. I think, you know, Aurobindo is doing something very different than I think Yeats is doing in that sense. It's, he's familiar with the occult, but he wants to kind of bring a more expansive intelligence, like into the you know, into the field. And so this is very powerful stuff, I think, if we treat it that way. And I would like to read material a little before we come in, so that when we perform it, and it's not a performance for any audience per se, it's really for the interior audience. When we perform it, we can give most attention to the, you know, the qualities of the voice and of the imagery that's being invoked. This is my response to your suggestions.
I thought that was great, Marco. You're talking about what was Milton seeing? Well, we know he wasn't seeing anything with his physical eyes. Okay. And I think we don't have to be that clear about this, because it could be quite fuzzy, actually. The different sensory systems, the visual, the auditory, the kinesthetic, touch and taste. And the voice, and how they're all related and overlap. And, you know, in different kinds of presentations, we'll emphasize different kinds of arrangements of the senses. Like in a podcast, for instance, we're listening to one or more voices. And we may have images, like in radio. I remember the little girl who said, I like the radio better than the TV because the pictures are better. So she's obviously drawing from some synesthesia. So I think this is what is interesting to me. Also, the comparativist, I think you were talking about this, Jeffrey. What's in between these poets, and is there a conversation going on between them, or is there a conversation between these poets and the poets that they love, that they may have in common? And I think also I'm looking at, I just pulled this down from my shelf, I've not read it yet, a Walt Whitman and Modern Music. There's a CD includes Mark Blindstein, he's a composer, 4 Whitman songs. Kurt Weill did 4 Whitman songs. George Crumb does something called The Apparition. These are all, you know, spin-offs from Whitman's verse. So I think that's a very interesting area that I could like personally start to explore. But I remember also, in a class I did with Marge Phillips. She taught voice. She was British. She had a cigarette. She has a very deep voice like this, very deep alto, beautiful voice. But one of the students got up and did, the quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle leaves from heaven unto the place beneath. It is twice blessed. And she went, no, 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 darling. This is not going to work. You're from the Bronx. Portia is not from the Bronx. And she ran into this sort of diatribe, but I realized that she was being very compassionate, because this, she basically told this young lady, you sound like you come from the Bronx, and you do come from the Bronx, but if you want to play Shakespeare, you have to be very critical of your own culture in a way you've never had to be before. And then you can start playing Portia, because she's talking about the quality of mercy. Do you know anything about mercy? And the little girl was just like, And she said, mercy is a very big idea. And you have to get behind that. You have to know what that is. So I think that this is a big challenge, but I think that that's what these poets are calling upon us. They're invoking in us. And I would like it to, rather than be performance-oriented, to be rehearsal-oriented. Like, this is a rehearsal. You can make mistakes, you can fall on your face, and everyone will support you in whatever you need, which may be very unique to you. But I think there's something about, what are you most drawn to in this text? To chunk it down and chunk it slow. You may not get the whole thing, but there may be just one speech that really turns you on. And what is it about that? And I think that would be a great help for us to sort of break, chunk down, chunk slow, find the passages that move us or make us curious or baffle us completely. And then, share attention around that. And then put it all together, because there may be different kinds of passages that each of us are drawn to. And I think then we have a kind of mosaic, and we have a sort of, some sort of ensemble effect that might start to happen. And then I think we can take a big chunk of the text and find the sequence between those parts that we were most drawn to. Find what's in between those. And then I think you can find something like a through line, something that holds the text together, which might, at a first or initial reading, just overwhelm you with there's just too much going on here. So that's just one idea. And also I want to make a plea for memorizing. I remember, who's that great American? No, he was a British poet. I know you, Auden. And he said, he taught poetry. And what he had was not a survey course where you read 101 poems by 101 poets. He had the students memorize one poem and deliver that memorized poem. That was it. And he thought that was of much more value than reading 1,000 poets in one of these Western poetry or world poetry courses. And I like both, actually. I love to read poetry from every place. But I also just wanted to sort of offer that as maybe I have a question mark about that. Maybe like, a little bit of Milton goes a very long way, but he also had some very short poems, some sonnets that are quite striking, and I think are easily memorized. So anyway, I'm just putting that as a possibility of something that, if you would enjoy that, you might want to try it, because there's something incredibly liberating about reciting poetry that you've memorized, and you don't need the book, because it's in you've got the rhythm, and you can catch the rhythm, and then you can share the rhythm. So thank you.
I think what I'm getting from this is, so maybe we could meet next week, because I think kind of the discussion is not finished today in a way. It's we're in the middle of something, and maybe it needs another chunk of time around it. So I could propose, although it may be premature, to, I don't know, read the first couple of pages of Milton, just to sort of put us in a mood. around that, but maybe not right away. We would have a discussion first, and then we would lead into the reading of Milton. I'm happy to read that section myself, unless somebody absolutely is dying to read it. But you will all get a chance to reread, because we will read some of these passages more than once. So depending on what interests are there. So so maybe a way to open it up. Also, I want you all to think about what you would like to lead or animate, let's say, as to use this rephrase that Marco did. So you could almost think about which poem, which poet, which piece you would like to, you could almost come up with a kind of a template for the session. So you could say, well, we're going to look at these poems by Whitman and this poem by Blake, and that's it. And that's what the session, or it could be just Whitman, or it could be just Blake, or it could be just a section of, and in a kind of sequence. With Milton, we'll do it sequentially, but it could be whatever you're interested in doing, and let's play with the form as we go into this, rather than structure it with, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. So let's leave it up to what each individual wants to do as an animation exercise. If you can write enough about it ahead of time, which poems that you want to do, so that people can read them ahead of time, so that we have a little bit of background for each of the sessions. So as a kind of a opening structure, I don't know whether that makes sense, or am I clear enough about it, or? I
think you're open. You're open enough. You're not necessarily clear, but you're definitely open. I definitely appreciate the openness to the structure that we could self-organize when we make our intentions clearer as they get clearer.
Yeah.
And what kind of support do we need to make these readings come alive, which might be different for each of us. And
I also love your rehearsal idea, this idea that we're rehearsing not for performing. I think that's a very important point. But I also, because we're going to be doing voice, I think it might be useful to have some voice exercises at the beginning of sessions. If we could draw on you, Johnny, to help us, out of your theater background, if you could, some short exercises so that we can sort of get our voices into shape to do some of the reading. Yeah.
Great.
Well, I'll just say, and I want to hear from Doug and Andrew too, but that I do wish to read the whole book, but I'm not in a rush, and by the whole book I mean Paradise Lost. With Whitman, really, I don't feel like I have to read everything. I think that whatever is most wants to come alive in a given week or session is fine with me, and the same with Blake. And I would suggest I'm open to other voices which may want to come in. I don't have anything preconceived, but perhaps somewhere in the gap between these poets and Aurobindo, we may find some other voices that suggest themselves. So I'll just leave that open as well. And I like the approach of openness and letting it emerge, and finding also, I mean, it is a counterpoint to Savitri, but I know in the framing, maybe we need to figure out some other way because it's really they're very different, and even the way that we're approaching Savitri, and that Matteo is approaching it as as kind of an organizer, it's really mantric. He's looking at it as a kind of spiritual enactment. And I want to draw on that here, but I think we're also doing something a little bit different. And part of that may have to do with this rehearsal idea, which I appreciate that refinement. I don't want to perform. There's people that, I don't even want to compete with, the legions who would be so much better. But I want these rehearsals to lead to my own performances in other contexts. And so the rehearsal and the refinement of vision and voice, I think, are going to be part of what makes this really valuable for me personally. And so I'm, and I think that I feel like that's going to mesh really well too with what others desire. But I want to hear what that may be as well. So that's your cue.
I don't know what you guys think, but I'd actually really prefer if we have like certain readings to do or something like that. I'm happy to have it sort of open-ended, but there's only a limit to how open-ended a discussion can be when there's not like actual text being discussed. Do you know what I mean? Like,
I don't think I meant that. That's probably what wasn't very clear. I do mean that we have a structured text.
Okay, yeah.
It's just that I'm saying I don't want to be the one who decides every time what that structured text is. I want you guys to think about what structured texts, what structures you want for the sessions coming up yourself, and not just me.
Yeah, that makes sense. But like, at least for the next two, like if we're doing Paradise Lost, I would really appreciate if we could have like something like, we're going to discuss book 1 next week, or we're going to discuss book 1, the first 10 pages, or just something that's like some kind of constraint, so we know what relatively speaking we're going to be actually discussing. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. It's just that for next time, I'm because I think we still have some more discussion to do about the general thing. I want to leave some time for discussion and some time for the reading. So I don't think we're going to get a lot of the reading done. So I will put up on the forum a specific number of pages that we will look at. Okay. I just need to look at the text and time it a little bit so that we have some idea about how much text we can do in that time, because I'm not quite sure how that works out. So I want to do that before I commit here to it.
Yeah, as long as there's something. I mean,
I also want to. I don't know how to ask this question. Discussion. Is there anything else about discussion? What kind of discussion? Does that discussion have a size or a shape? Discussion can mean a lot of different things depending on a lot of different variables. And I guess what I'm interested in from you, Andrew, this is sort of personal. I like the first person, the second person, the third person, and the interplay between. And I believe you have an interest in integral theory, and you've posted a lot of interesting stuff on integral theory. And this is my desired outcome for you, which may have absolutely nothing to do with what you want. But I feel like I have a lot I can learn from you. And if there's some way that we could weave together, or you could enter into the weave of your critical readings, drawing upon a wide range of critics who are professionals, who are doing something that I can't do. I can't do what Harold Bloom does. But I can learn from Harold Bloom. And I can go back in my own little laboratory and play around with some of his ideas. And then I can, and that can enrich my personal experience. So I would hope we can have discussions that draw upon our actual embodied experience. And if we could take some of our own first person accounts of that, like this word Is there anything else about that word? Whereabouts does that word come from? And then you have a sense of it. And it's kind of like doing reverse engineering in a way. You're taking a text and then you're moving it into your own your sensorium. And then I believe that that creates a vibration that can supplement our sort of readings of the great critics. And they're great critics because they do what they do extremely well. So I'm all for reading Harold Bloom and Fletcher. I'm going to read him, and Northrop Frye. I think you mentioned the Fearful Symmetry that you read recently. So I definitely, and I want to reread critics that I've read, that I put away because I didn't understand them, and now maybe I can. So anyway, I'm just putting that out there. Maybe we can sort of be sensitive to what other people need. So anyway, so it's sort of like kind of a support group, and it's not like a teacher doing a presentation lecture and we're going to do a pop quiz at the end of it. I think we've all been trained in that pretty well. And I think what we're doing is sort of like much more peer-to-peer and sort of like a salon kind of atmosphere. More like a seminar, I guess. But anyway, I'm just putting that out there. We're doing a different kind of education, sort of a self-education, or maybe even a re-education.
Sorry.
I was going to suggest, Andrew, if you want to find because we're up to the 90 minutes, and I was trying to keep this smaller in size than longer in size, and I'm hesitant to go too much over 90 minutes, which was kind of my limit. But I would like us to sort of, if you could pick a poem from Whitman that you like, Andrew, and read it as a kind of a closing out for the session today, and then we'll pick up the discussion the next week.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Does that sound good to everyone else?
I would love to hear, but also if you have any response to what John was suggesting or saying about the interweaving first, second, third person, and kind of, you know, like we're figuring this out as we go, and we've at least John, myself, Jeffrey, and Doug have done a number of groups, but they've always been a little bit different, and we're always kind of figuring it out as we go. And also each person like adds their own quality, you know, and their own sort of spice to the mix. So I think that's kind of what he was getting at, is like, how can we bring it in? Like, how can we bring in the rehearsal and the voice with the critical perspectives, and kind of find the balance between the, I don't know, he spoke for himself, but I would love to hear what you would respond to that, and then Whitman, and certainly not to go too far over. I thought we were going for 2 hours. I'm glad to hear we're going a little bit shorter, but that does mean we have to focus. So that'll be my last I say, and then I'll just look forward to hearing your.
Yes, and I would love to hear any response, and also I looking forward to hearing your voice. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, Doug, if I don't know if you wanted to say anything also. I don't know, but I don't know. I'm open to having discussions, whatever discussions means, and I guess I'm used to like discussions in the context of like the various graduate programs I've been in, for better, for worse. Some of them were wonderful and illuminating. Others were not. And I think sometimes it depends on having some kind of facilitator in a way. I mean, I think a salon is a lot different than a class. And I think there's probably good things and bad things about both forums for thinking and discussing and stuff. Yeah, I don't know. Like, I had a really good teacher at Case, I live in Cleveland. There's this university here called Case Western, and I was in a PhD program for about a year here in English, and then I dropped out. It was not my thing, but I had a really good teacher named Michael Clune, who I've talked about sometimes in Infinite Conversations, and he was really like text centered, but he wasn't really student centered. I don't know if that's a relevant distinction for you guys. Like, he cared more about the text than he cared about the students in a way. So he could be really like intense and intimidating and weird sometimes. And that's not necessarily conducive for learning, arguably. I mean, it depends on what your take is pedagogically, but I found him to be a great teacher because he cared so ridiculously much about the text that it was great to hear him talk about lit. But it wasn't, I don't think he would be a good person for like the salon context, because it was more based on the text and not based so much on the students or the participants. And the salon context seems more based on the students in some ways. I don't know, maybe it's sort of based on the text, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. That's
I would like both. I mean, when I get into a text, I'm pretty precise about it. But there's only so much you can do, and we're dealing with a lot of text.
Yeah.
So I think finding the balance between kind of the rigor, that you would get reading a text comprehensively and discussing it, and then the depth I think that you get by focusing on, something that has particular resonance, which you can quote animate. That to me is an attractive option. And anyway, I don't think they're mutually exclusive or have to be. But thank you.
Yeah.
I guess I'll make a very brief comment about what's been said, and I'll add in that I will prefer, for myself, my focus will be around memorization as well. Well, that's one aspect of it, but that's a key component that's new to me, that I want to experience something that is not my own words, inserting it in here, and it becomes something great just by having it there and releasing it over and over again. And in relation to what's being said right now, and we all, as we mentioned, will likely do individual hosting, or so Jeffrey will do next week perhaps, then John, then Andrew, whatever order arises, and we will each bring our own flavor. And I'm sure you've witnessed that, Andrew, and other conversations if you followed along. And for example, myself, I know even if I study these texts and spend an entire month coming up with what I want to say, that when I come in, I will stumble over my words. But I have this creative element that I bring forth that tends, just like a lot of people know about Johnny, can take us into this zone. And same with you, Andrew. Your writing allows it, even if you're not speaking directly from that spiritual realm. Some of your writing has taken me at least into a different zone, and that's what I appreciate about each individual here. We each have that capability because we're passionate about what we bring to the playing field or whatever, the table. So yeah, looking forward to the future weeks, and if you still feel up for it, if you have a poem memorized, Andrew, if you'd like to read from Whitman, we'd appreciate it.
I haven't memorized a lot of Whitman. The only poem I ever memorized was a poem by a poet named Anthony Hecht. He's a sort of formalist poet, and he wrote a poem that was in the book that many Jews use for you can't recall the holiday, but it's called Yom Kippur, and it's a Day of Atonement. And he had a poem in the back of that book that I memorized but it's not, it's sort of dark. It's not really like Whitman, but okay, so I don't really know what to read. Maybe the Bathers episode, because we talked about that. Okay.
I would love it if you would do that one.
Yeah, it's so good.
It's X-rated though. Actually, it's not X-rated, but you know, there's something that he's not saying that's extremely, you know. Anyway, I'll let you do it. Go.
Yeah, I need to find it. It's, I don't know if you guys know this, but like in the first edition, there are no like numbers separating the stanzas. I don't know if there are numbers separating the stanzas in the later editions, but it's sort of weird. It's like this, it's so original. I don't know, it's really original. Okay, let's see if we can find it. I wrote a whole paper. Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Was this the 28 young men bathed by
Yeah,
the shore?
You have it?
At least in the numbered, it's number 11.
Oh,
my
yeah.
just picked up has a great picture here. I don't know if you can
Oh, okay. Maybe if I, here it is. Thank you. Okay, so and then before we even read the 28 young men, there's a passage about Whitman protecting a runaway slave, which is relevant, I think, in terms of what Marco was bringing up about ethical concerns. And the part about the runaway slave is really, really important and interesting in and of itself.
Do you want to do both of them?
Yeah, sure. That's a good idea. But then it's also interesting to think about, like, how did Whitman write about this very moving passage with a runaway slave and then somehow move into this Bathers episode? And I'm not saying that he wrote them like one after the other, because he clearly was revising his notebooks, you know. But it's crazy. Like in the first edition, there's the only thing separating the runaway slave passage from the Bathers episode is white space.
I think that's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
What's happening in the in-between?
Exactly. Yeah.
So like a liminal zone for as you read, there's something in the in-between that's very suggestive, I think. As it switches them from the runaway slave to 28 bathers. There's a juxtaposition in that cluster of images. I think it's very suggestive.
Yeah, and it's important to pay attention to those shifts. You know, like Ashbury, for example, he shifts his thinking in ways that are, I don't know how he's like from another planet or something. I don't even know how to explain it. But it's important to think about this also in terms of Whitman. So, okay, so here we go. The runaway slave came to my house and stopped outside. I heard his motions crackling the twigs of the woodpile. Through the swung half door of the kitchen, I saw him limpsy and weak, and went where he sat on a log and led him in and assured him and brought water and filled a tub for his sweated body and bruised feet and gave him a room that entered from my own and gave him some coarse, clean clothes and remember perfectly well his revolving eyes and his awkwardness and remember putting plasters on the galls of his neck and ankles. He stayed with me a week before he was recuperated and passed north. I had him sit next to me at table. My forelock leaned in the corner, which I think is a gun. And then there's this weird white space. And then he goes into this where he says, 28 young men bathed by the shore. 28 young men, and all so friendly. 28 years of womanly life, and all so lonesome. She owns the fine house by the rise of the bank. She hides, handsome and richly dressed, aft the blinds of the window. Which of the young men does she like the best? Ah, the homeliest of them is beautiful to her. Where are you off to, lady? For I see you. You splash in the water there, yet stay stock still in your room. Dancing and laughing along the beach came the 29th bather. The rest did not see her, but she saw them and loved them. The beards of the young men glistened with wet. It ran from their long hair. Little streams passed all over their bodies. This is my favorite part. An unseen hand also passed over their bodies. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. The young men float on their backs. Their white bellies swell to the sun. They do not ask who seizes fast to them. They do not know who puffs and declines with pendant and bending arch. They do not think whom they souse with spray. Yeah. And then one more thing to think about is what does Whitman do when he uses ellipses? Like if you have the actual text, there's ellipses in the last stanza after sun. And like, what does that do? Because I don't remember ever coming across that formal feature very often in poems before Whitman. So like, and he does it a lot. So what does that accomplish? You know, it's a really interesting feature of his poems. He does it again with the Runaway Slave too, between table and the forelock.
I'm getting something quite forbidden. Young men float on their backs. Their white bellies swell to the sun. They do not ask who seizes fast to them. And just previous to that, an unseen hand also passed over their bodies. It descended tremblingly from their temples and ribs. And we see the woman in the house behind the window. And I think he suggests that she has an imaginal body that is behind the window and also out in the water with the men. And those unseen hands, I believe, belong to her subtle body. I think I sensed something similar in He Stayed With Me a Week before he was recuperated and passed north. I had him sit next to me at table. My forelock leaned in the corner. I think it's very suggestive. And I think that's what those ellipses assist our imaginations. But I think there's something that he stayed with me a week before he was recuperated and passed north. Is there anything else about that week? I think that's extremely suggestive, especially after such a sensual description. I mean, he gives this man a bath. You know, he gives him coarse, clean clothes. He puts plaster on the galls of his neck and ankles. I mean, as I was listening to your voice, and you read it really well, you really drew me in with your voice. I could feel something vibrate there. But I think it's a love poem. I really do. I think it's very understated. There's almost all of it is unstated, and but I think it's implied that there's something very erotic and very loving in this description, and a great deal that was left out for obvious reasons. And when he was writing, by the way, sodomy was punishable by death. So we always have to remember that. that this was a different kind of culture than we have now. And this was way before the sexual revolution. But I do think that Whitman started that ball rolling. So thank you for that reading and the quality of your voice. And I feel like it helped me to focus my attention. And I wasn't looking at the text. I was just listening to the qualities of your voice. So that was what was conveyed to me.
I agree. The voice was, the reading was really, really present, really nice, really slow. I like that. Because I have a tendency to want to move forward through Whitman quickly because the language leads me that way, but I like the slow reading. But I noticed that these ellipses, I noticed it earlier today because I opened the book and I looked at that first page of the Song of Myself, and they're full of that first page, those ellipses, but they're all in this, I mean, it's all the sensuous image, and the ellipses are all in the essential, in with the sensual images. So perhaps, Johnny, you're right, that there's some relationship between the ellipses and the sensuality of the text.
I probably need to get going pretty soon. I need to get ready for work, but two things. One other thing to think about that I've wondered about sometimes, it might be interesting for you guys, is like, think about the runaway slave episode that we just read. Like, we have no idea if Whitman actually did this, right? Like, we don't know if this is actually an element of his like autobiographical memory. So if it's not, like, what is actually happening? Like, is it just, could you use imagination to talk about it? Is Whitman like imagining a situation where he could like finally move past these strictures and structures of society and like have an actual human exchange with like runaway slave, i.e. another person, you know, who happens to be black and a slave, you know what I mean? Like, it's, and then also like, Whitman has endured for like 200 years. So like, what does that mean? That he imagined this exchange, but now like, people have read it like millions of times, and and even if he didn't actually do it in real life, but he imagined it, you know, that's interesting to think about. Like, what does that even mean? That he imagined this like very moving exchange, even if he didn't experience it like autobiographically.
If he may have,
He may have, yeah.
I mean, the line that got me, that I thought, when I thought, well, this really did happen, in whatever sense, maybe not really autobiographically, but the revolving eyes and his awkwardness. When I heard that, and that kind of just gave me I don't know, it was like almost a mark of authenticity. You almost can't imagine revolving eyes. Like, you have to see it, like, before you can imagine it, or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think he definitely like saw, like, he clearly witnessed the world, you know, in ways that we don't really have words for, maybe. But like, I don't know. I'm actually quite okay with arguing that it's imagined. I mean, the devil's in the details, and like the best writers, you know, they know what details to use to make it seem real. But who knows if he actually had that experience, you know? And like, there's a lot of parts of Song of Myself that might totally be imaginative and not actually real. But I can't be late to work, so I need to.
Yeah.
Really nice to talk to you guys.
Thank you, Andrew. That's a great question.
Yeah, hopefully we can do this next week and start talking about Paradise Lost.
Great.
Great.
Good.
Okay.
Wow.
Just wanted to note that it's 28 lines if we read both of those together. I think without the ellipses there, but this is proof that we can focus on 28 or 30 lines of poetry and have a great discussion. So
I like that we chunked it down and chunked it slow. And I'm sure there's even more resonances that we haven't tapped into yet. I know that a story that Oscar Wilde tells about visiting Walt Whitman. He was an elderly man. And you know, there are people who say that this is not homosexual. But I know that Oscar Wilde said Walt Whitman asked Oscar Wilde to sit in his lap and to give him a kiss. And I think Oscar Wilde obeyed. So I have a funny feeling there's a whole lot more going on in Whitman's performance here that is unsaid. And, you know, I have question marks. I remember a great critic, I can't remember his name. I actually worked for him briefly. I don't know if he's still alive, he may have passed away, but I had read him when I was a teenager. And I told this elderly gentleman, he was in his 90s. He was a very, very famous American critic in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s. But he said, I quoted him, I said, I remember you said about Shakespeare that when people say, oh, these are just conventions, it wasn't homosexual, it was just conventions. And that you said, homosexual conventions come from homosexual people. And I remember reading that when I was in high school, and it really amazed me. And I was talking to this elderly gentleman in his 90s about his own work and how it had made an impression on me when I was a young man. And I thought that just had a wonderful feeling of connection between a critic and his exploration. And of course, this critic happened to be gay. But I'm just sharing this with you because I think there's a very rich tradition and lots of ellipses. There are lots of breaks and lots of gaps and discontinuities and different kinds of echoes and so much of the unsaid. And anyway, I'm just sharing that and just expressing appreciation for this time we've spent together. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to say that it's been, I think it promises, it has promise as a discussion for the next little while, as you say, Johnny, bringing our spaces below the neck. I mean, maybe not only below the neck, but
I think it's about blending the cognitive and the somatic. We don't want to have one or the other. That would just create another binary. But to have that blending.
Yeah, I like the microcosmic orbit as well, where there's a kind of flow. There's an ascending currents and descending currents, but there's a flow, and I think we get that too with this way too. I think we get that too with our Aurobindo and involutionary currents and evolutionary. It's all of one piece in a certain way. So
and I love the way Doug brought up Dylan Thomas, and then Marco, you brought up Yeats, because when we're talking about Blake, we are talking about these peripheral voices in the literary landscape. And although maybe Yeats and Dylan Thomas they're probably considered fairly mainstream, but they are peripheral voices in the way they are composed within themselves, right? So, and they echo each other, right?
I would almost call them Gnostic voices.
Yes. Yeah.
And Thomas read, like, there's an album, Thomas read Yeats. I mean, by read, I mean performed, recited, that he recorded an album. And I did, he did one-man performances. He kind of revived the, Elizabethan theater in a certain way for poetry. And he was a wit. He was an amazing wit. I listened to a recording. It was a panel involving himself, Henry Miller, another avant-garde filmmaker. He was probably pretty smashed, but what was so exciting or just fun about listening to this was that the person was actually congruent with the poems. That was what was so revelatory to me in that he had no. I just really enjoyed him as a person, and so what's unsaid, I think, is some who we're tuning into sometimes is we're tuning into his presence that's behind the words, behind the poems. It's just past the ellipsis. It's the the unsaid, and I'm just loving getting to know these poets. It's almost like finding long lost friends or something for the first time. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you, and I guess we'll reconvene next week. Yes?
Next week at the same time. Yeah.
And there's always the forum. If you find any, I would love to get that link to that panel discussion because
I will.
That would be fun to listen to.
Oh yes.
It reminds me of every Christmas when I go out to Victoria. 2 years now in a row, my brother's taken me along to an evening which is a reading, a performance of A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. Oh. So with a choir that does a cappella singing, interspersed with a man sitting in a chair reading the text.
Wow.
And it's gorgeous. And I have a little clip of it because I record, I took a little bit of video footage, but I don't think it'll break any copyright things to put it up. I'll just give you a little taste of what it's like. It's gorgeous. And and we go because a friend of mine sings in the a cappella choir. And so we go to support her, but it is a gorgeous experience.
I think we're living in a wonderful time. The technology is really bringing us these magnificent performances on YouTube now. It used to be you would have to take months of research hunting for this stuff. But I think there's something very powerful about listening to the voice of a poet. And many times I've heard their voice, then I can read them and understand them. But very often I can read a poet and not get them at all. But I think with Pin Sound, there's a huge archive. And at Naropa, there's a huge archive of poets giving lectures and talking about their own work. And it's illuminating, I think, because you're getting that direct hit from the human voice. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, now I get their poetry at a much deeper level than I would if I only had a text in front of me. So, thank you.
Ashbury, I just because Andrew brought him up earlier, but hearing his voice, I think, is very clarifying, actually, with his poetry. And I don't know that much of it, but the little bits that I've been able to piece together have been really assisted by that. So anyway.
Yeah, because I did like what I read of him. I did look him up and I did read some things. I did like what I read, so.
All right.
Okay.
Bye.
What do we got? Tomorrow we got something, don't we? No? Or maybe it's just Friday.
It's Thursday, isn't it?
Aren't you doing the Axial Age?
That's Friday.
Friday. Okay. So we have a day off tomorrow.
Yeah, we have a day off tomorrow.
Well, I'll see you around campus.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.